How do empires come to be? Is it through military expansion, economic dominance, or diplomatic maneuvering? Well, this story is about an empire that excelled at all three. The year is 4000 BC, and the American people had a dream to create an empire of their own that would rule the world from sea to shining sea. In this, the leader of the still small tribe, Abraham Lincoln, shared in their ideals and knew that reaching this gargantuan goal wouldn't be easy, as every manner of military expansion, economic dominance, and diplomatic maneuvering would in turn be employed against the American people by every other tribe vying for dominance. So would they be able to rise from this struggle as the America we know today, or will they drown as another failed nation that flew too close to the sun? America settled their capital on cotton, ethically sourced this time, but you need more than one city for an empire. And before they could plan out their promised nation, there were questions that needed to be answered. How large is this land? Are there other tribes? Were they friendly? So before they could even decide on a course of action, they needed to discover what it was that they were working with. They first decided to follow the coast and see where it would take them, but they were disappointed to find that the south wasn't particularly interesting, at least when contrasted with the north, where they met the people of Canada. This naturally led to the question, would they be friend or foe? Nonetheless, it would be prudent to ensure that they only had to face one front, and so the adventurers down south were rewarded for their loyalty with free land that would become the city we now know as Jacksonville. But this led to another issue. With such a distance in between their major settlements, they needed another outpost to fully control the 13 colonies. Therefore, when they discovered a Canadian settling party unprotected, debates were had on whether they should risk confrontation with their northern neighbors. But it would turn out to be all for naught. As it turns out, they couldn't take the settler from Canada. Why? I couldn't tell you. Instead, they would need to seek another way to connect their two opposing cities, and so decide to invest into the much more cost-effective and faster travel of seafaring. And as they were experimenting on what boats worked, troubling reports came from back west, where unlike a sea, there was nothing but wild forests and hilly hills. An unending landmass with untold dangers promising riches to the souls brave enough to venture into the unknown. Spurred on by the opportunity of discovery, the American people decided upon a course of action that would change their destinies forever. They would reach the end of the world as the dream of manifest destiny began to rock in its cradle. This decision of westward discovery led to the Americans making a shocking revelation. The wilderness was not uninhabited. In their way were the native people who've settled and hunted in this land for generations. And after preliminary talks on their potential vassalage to America failed, America used this as justification to prepare for war. The closest unit in the area immediately got hit by the heavily armored infantry, and just as it looked like they were about to break under the heavy charge, they managed to regroup and hold the line, subsequently responding with a ranged counterattack to devastating effect. This stalemate was in fact favorable to the Americans, as all they had to do was resist until reinforcements could arrive. But the barbarians weren't going to let that happen, as they began an operation to flank and pincer the lone unit. With the potential of destruction looming large, the order was made and a retreat was sounded. This defeat would not be the last of America's attempts at resettlement, as at this moment a second army appeared from the south, forcing the spearmen to fortify in their camp lest their people be eliminated. This would lead to mass confusion, as the warrior didn't get the memo and was baited out into the open without any support in sight, against a slinger unit who just replenished their losses and were preparing for a second round. The spearmen, seeing this losing situation made worse with further reports of reinforcements, decided on a last-ditch counterattack, but unlike the slingers, the warriors were more adept at fighting in close quarters, forcing the survivors to scatter to the wind and leaving the camp at the mercy of the Americans. On the other side of the battle, the slingers were finally able to force the barbs to surrender, winning the battle, as they agreed on the Americans' demands to resettle west of here, opening up this now uninhabited land for American colonization. This victory, while minor in scale, would be remembered forever as the catalyst for strengthening the American resolve to reach the fabled Second Sea, believing that God himself had promised them control of both sides of the continent. A challenge that was easier said than done, as the barbarians weren't the only people they would face on their journey west. The first of these people was the powerful Aztec Empire led by their fabled Jaguar warriors. With their strength, America decided it best to centralize the state, firstly by setting up a third settlement to connect their fragmented empire. The founding of Charleston coincided with the Northern Scouting Party making the surprising discovery that Canada's borders connected to another. The Cree inhabited the northwestern portion of of this North American continent and made the fourth and final of the major players in this northern four-way Cold War. These discoveries confirmed the suspicions of the American leaders. Competition would be fierce, and to have the capabilities to overpower all the other competitors, America needed to develop their lands, beginning by hiring labor that moves to extract a Nile resource to sell for enough profits to fund a settling expedition. But that plan was curtailed when pirates were spotted close to Washington shores. Instead of making a profit, America was forced to humiliate themselves and ask Canada for a loan that was used to fund the fruits of their now completed research, constructing a vessel sturdy enough to withstand both the sea and the raiders on their shores. This would prove a shrewd investment, as the galley's crew was more effective than the pirates, who were more used to attacking unarmed merchant vessels than ships that could fight back, forcing them away from the coast and opening up the resources of the Atlantic for exploitation. Despite this victory, it was overshadowed by the discovery made on the other side of the world, where America's dreams were finally realized. The edge of the world where the sea overtook the land. While a beautiful sight, wasn't the end of their age of discovery, as the galleys had chased the pirates so far south that they discovered the Gulf of Mexico, giving the 13 colonies the complete picture on the landmass and people that they would be facing. But like the once tribal Americans had evolved to fund continental expeditions and military efforts, so too did their dreams and ideals. It wasn't enough to want to explore and reach the second sea, they wanted to control it. And talk began spreading about the promise of manifest destiny, a promise that God himself had ordained. While the dream was alive, fulfilling that promise would be a gargantuan task. With so many native tribes and larger civilizations, they would need to reorient their entire national philosophy to center around colonization. But every journey has a starting point, and for America, the starting point was Indianapolis, providing all the corn an empire could ever need. But corn isn't exactly lucrative, and it was evident that to fund more of these expensive expeditions, they'd need to find a way to make money. So this led to the leaders taking particular interest in internal trade, which, while proving a great way to ensure the empire stayed connected through roads and resource distribution, wasn't the best way to increase the empire's wealth, at least for now, because this idea of trade would soon bear fruit when they met the nation of Grand Colombia, another independent civilization with more money than they knew what to do with, in particular need of cotton. A bidding war subsequently ensued that was eventually won by Poundmaker, bringing enough wealth to continue building America's cities for the sole purpose of producing more settlers. That wasn't the only advantage of trading relations with the outside world, as the good relations developed from increased trade led to an eventual declaration of friendship between America and the Aztec, allowing the Americans to forego their southern border, much to the chagrin of the opposition, and focus on the western deserts. Now, while the desert would normally be unsuitable for human habitation, this one was different. With rivers, floodplains, and beautiful natural wonders, this perfect location suffered from just a single problem. It was located on the other side of the continent, and like a goth girl with My Little Kitty bedsheets, they knew that lusting after such an unobtainable city would ruin their lives. But they still went for it anyways. To reach that Petra city, they'd have to go west, attacking a native tribe on the way that would soon change the course of this game forever. But not for their strength, since this camp was dispatched as easily as the others. It was what they found that would prove so important. Until then, the loot was sent back to the capital, where the Governor Magnus had just finished overseeing the construction of a harbor, turning Washington into the jewel of the eastern seaboard, cementing its importance in global trade where the wealth and status would serve to propel America to a golden age, serving as the catalyst for the patronage of classical cultural works. But as America was focusing on the advancement of society, Canada threw a wrench into their overarching goal, settling the city of Milwaukee, which could have turned out to be more disastrous if their ploy to settle American cities with their warriors proved successful. It's too bad the AI is below the mental cutoff point to declare a formal war. To prevent this aggressive neighbor from cutting off American settlement plans entirely, the city of Memphis was established, which Canada didn't take too kindly to. I'm gonna kill him. The setback showed to America's leaders that the rate of settling was far too slow to reach the second sea, birthing the idea of political philosophy, leading to a government based on the ideals of the Constitution, a classical republic, which allowed America to construct an ancestral hall in Washington, a building that would further incentivize settlers, providing more funds and builders paid for by the state to rapidly build up any new settlements. And with that, the day of settling the desert Petra was inching ever closer. Barbs, in my Petra city? That's fine, as a forward base in Texas is necessary for... This was turning out to be disastrous as both the Canadians and Aztecs were attacking from two fronts. This chaos, while infuriating, would pale in comparison to what the fourth actor in this Cold War was about to do. It was over, as the Second Sea was now impossible for America to reach without going to war. But how would they manage to build up a military force strong enough to take on fully fledged civilizations? They would somehow have to establish a fighting force strong enough to support their powerful ideals. To do that, advancements in technology would have to be made, and both the research and army would require a large amount of gold. Before that, there was still unclaimed land to be taken. Firstly, the city of Kansas would prove the extent of America's westward expansion for now, while the city of New Orleans would cut off any Aztec infiltration. But there were still some that were unhappy with the settlements so close to their borders. But being separated by a sea, America's leaders weren't too worried about that enemy, settling Montgomery in the same general vicinity. With the land grab now officially over, there was no other way to increase power through land acquisition, so the only way to get stronger was to increase the productivity of the land they already had through scientific advancement. Campuses were constructed in every city to facilitate development in military technology. Something the governor sent to quell the Kansas uprising was adept at, serving as an additional source of science. But people work harder when they're happier, and there's no better source of happiness than watching gladiators fight lions to the death in an organized spectacle. And so a coliseum began construction. During this period of technological advancement, the alliance with the Aztecs was further broadened to include aid in scientific developments. That was not enough to prevent what would happen next. Without reaching the Second Sea, a sort of depression fell upon the population, which led to the Great American Dark Age. And in their moment of weakness, another leader sensed an opportunity and launched a surprise invasion. Anyways, we need to find a way to get another golden age. To do that, a period of national development was launched, constructing districts to serve specific needs, with the centerpiece of this plan being the finally complete Colosseum. Unfortunately, the policy of scientific advancement was not going as well. Why can't I build over this? I have no in-universe explanation. It wasn't very crippling, though, since the only nation at war with America, Grand Columbia, immediately accepted peace when they heard Pedro had just signed an alliance. We're at war with someone else. Poundmaker? At this moment, Poundmaker had declared a war on America's ally, the Aztec, putting them in the middle of a two-front war. The issue was that America was in the midst of the modernization process and so wasn't ready at all for this two-front war. So they brought in Canada to turn it into a three-front war. The biggest casualty in this revelation was a warrior that decided to suicide charge after losing 60% of their strength. But it wasn't all wins for Poundmaker, where even his continued assailing of arrows did little to stop our vampire from raiding his commercial hub. But it was obvious that pillaging alone couldn't win this war, and so a large amount of trebuchets were set up to be used in a future offensive, but for now, were set up facing the Cree as the primary defensive lines. But in order to make use of the niter resource they found to upgrade their infantry and trebuchets, the state needed money, and the best way to get that was to establish a capitalistic merchant republic to fund the modernization of the military. By empowering the merchants, it was the Navy that saw the most benefit, as Francis Drake led a privateer fleet to bring the policy of economic competition to the rest of the world. A competition where he challenges you to stop him from stealing your economy. And with the Navy complete, all that was left was to find someone to lead the land army. And so multiple encampments were constructed, particularly in the south, to train great generals, which made it a good thing that Poundmaker was willing to make peace soon afterwards. A treaty that infuriated the Aztecs, as that forced them to do the same right when they were making gains. This mattered little for America, as this time of scientific and military developments made them one of the most advanced nations on Earth, leading to a renaissance in the Renaissance. And with their strong economic base, the military was almost ready. All they had to do was wait for bombards and line infantry to come in. That was until the former American ally Montezuma issued a declaration of war. This came at a terrible time where the American military was nowhere near ready with just warriors and trebuchets against knights and men-at-arms. Despite that, they had to make the best use of these units in their desperate defense. The trebuchets, already in perfect defensive position against the Cree, were quickly redirected towards the Aztecs, but the land army was woefully under-equipped. However, one of these units would prove decisive in the American defense. With their perfect positioning threatening Montezuma's supply routes, they had to redirect troops to dislodge him. But this defensive position meant that task wouldn't be easy. This gave enough time for the researchers in the capital to complete one of their first test runs, creating the musketmen unit that would prove to be decisive in changing the course course of this war. Their effectiveness was evident, so much so that a policy of industrialization was announced, with every city building industrial sectors to create as many of these musket men as possible. The military front may have stabilized, but further gains could be made diplomatically, where the former enemy, the Cree, were still bitter against their native rivals, while Lady Six Guy had a claim to the southern Aztecan Empire. These changes would take time to materialize, meaning that as of now, their more advanced steel clashes with our cobbled-together pieces of armor. But despite the disadvantage, the defenders, inspired by God and country, were able to hold on, with special regards being given to the Mountain Pass warriors who stood their ground against a cavalry charge, further confounding the Aztecan generals, forcing them to redirect more resources to supply their supply routes. Despite that success, it was still a terrible situation. Poe and the Kung Fu crew kerfuffled our forces in the south, whereas in the north they almost immediately dismantled our trebuchets, threatening to encircle the city of Kansas, which would lead to its eventual downfall. So drastic defensive measures were taken, and after the establishment of an arms factory, the first of the musket men were put into service. They'd have to wait for their time in combat, as all the way down south the privateer had concurrently begun raiding Mexican plantations, further constricting their supply routes. This aided in slowing down the Knight down south until the 3rd Musket Regiment could meet them in battle, preventing the Knight from encircling American forces. This development forced the Aztecs to retreat from the siege of Kansas City, allowing the defenders to establish fortifications on rough terrain. All except the Southern musketmen who made this possible, but with the added benefit of naval support, they were still able to stabilize the situation. With the defense of Kansas, a bright young star moved his way up the ranks to general of American forces in all of Texas. Dondera restructured the military during one of their greatest challenges, when the Aztecs regrouped and launched a piercing thrust into the lightly defended southern flank. Their cavalry formations pummeled America back, in part thanks to the excellent terrain for horses. But again, America refused to break. This bait was perfectly set up by General Dondera in Operation Nuts. But after establishing logistical lines, we realized that we weren't done yet, as the Bulge continued to penetrate the center, forcing an orderly retreat, further baiting Montezuma's units, and this is where the tides began to turn. The musketmen with naval support was able to move on the flanks concurrently with the 1st Musket Regiment on the opposite side. This envelopment was supported by the new bombard unit that launched devastating volleys on Monty's exposed center, eventually leading to the routing of the left flank. Despite their attempts at a fighting retreat, it was already too late. This was when one of our vampires entered the fray, discovering the fate of the 300 Americans. Their sacrifice was not in vain, as the panicking Aztecs were now in a full retreat, doing whatever they could to save themselves. As everyone redirected their focus to the Americans' attempts at capturing the land they called Texas. During the calm before the storm, the settlement of Beaumont was established as a forward operating base for the attack, as American forces began their advance. With the fighting now taking place on Aztec soil, the Americans were surprised to find minimal resistance, until they realized the Aztecs had fortified behind the river, flanked by their 2 cities. This turned out to be both a blessing and a curse, as the defensive lines meant that they could do nothing when our cannons sounded from the hilltops, eviscerating their fortifications, while gunpowder forces cut off supply lines from the south. This position was untenable, with a strategy from a now foregone era of warfare, as the city was soon taken and renamed as the state of Texas. This decisive American victory was sounded around the continent, with the sizable American minority in Milwaukee taking this moment of euphoria to launch a coup, before engaging in discussion to be annexed by the American Empire. After the siege of Texas, the Aztec had nothing left to defend their south, which would normally mean a free conquest, but muskets weren't built to take cities. With this Achilles heel brought to light, military scientists begun experimenting with new tactics in military organization. These new line tactics were to be put to use against the greatest threat America had faced up till now. The fortified mountain pass was necessary to take in order to reach the Second Sea, but with only half the army available for duty, this wouldn't be a short siege. To bypass these defenses, the Americans needed a man on the inside, a listening post in the Aztec capital. The new military structure of corps worked wonders against their cavalry, now equipped with the same gunpowder our forces possessed. While up north, the vampires were able to hold off the fort's counterattack to take out the cannons. The last breath of the Aztecs had sounded as soon after the southernmost Aztecan city, still in control of parts of Texas, was razed to the ground. But the mountain fort was proving a conundrum for American forces as it still stood strong. The decision was made to surround the fort and starve it into surrender, and after a years-long siege, finally sued for peace as America now controlled the strategic passage that opened into the northern Mexican desert. But Montezuma was building a second army led by his new cavalry formations. This evolution would have its hands full against the fully powered American industrial might, producing more soldiers than Montezuma could ever dream of sacrificing. And so, after the morale boost from Milwaukee electing to join the Union, the decision was made to invade California. The unmanned northern garrison was swiftly taken by line infantry and set ablaze, but the southern front was different, as the cannons that had proved instrumental to American success were almost dismantled in one day. With the reveal of a second city in the fog of war, this already difficult fight was made more perilous thanks to the now two-front assault, with Aztec and field cannons changing the art of war forever. They needed to be silenced, which was done when the spy forwarded their exact location to our headquarters and an ambush was launched, silencing the guns. What was unexpected was the garrison that was staunchly fortifying the city moving out to destroy one of our cannon armies. This was bait, and it worked masterfully as they were accosted from four fronts, leaving the city completely undefended. But with such a small garrison remaining, our own soldiers weren't looking much better. Being on campaign for so long, with so many battles having been fought, some were starting to show symptoms of shell shock, while others were struggling from exhaustion. But the great American spirit and promise of their spoils on the other end of that city propelled them to victory. After the surrender of the last Aztecan stronghold and the evaporation of their army, a peace was forced upon them, with Montezuma himself transferring his personal wealth to American coffers. But more importantly, the new borders established ensured the Aztecs would never rise to challenge American dominance, as the American promise of manifest destiny all those years ago was finally fulfilled. But as the forces began replenishing and the economy recovered, the people on both sides of the border were living in peace and prosperity, aside from one city, Phoenix. Honestly, considering how the Suns played last season, I'm surprised they didn't start rebelling earlier. And with the peace agreement established with the Aztecs, it was determined that the Kree were subterfuging and the city needed to be dealt with. But the Kree were not as weak as the Aztecs. The Americans needed a decisive edge, and their scientists discovered one with artillery. The issue was they had no idea how to power their powerful design. So a trade deal was established to purchase oil from the Incas after a promise that they would be utilized for civilian uses. With their now powerful artillery ready for use, the decision was made to declare war against the Kree, not by a message, but by opening fire on Fort Yosemite. To rally the troops around a national symbol, the Statue of Liberty was constructed in the New York area, a symbol of hope for every American out there that inspired many to join the Secret Service to personally spy on the Kree forces. But the issue of technological disparity was great, as the Kree already had infantry units. We no longer had the strongest units on the field. That was only the first of our issues, as the more pressing one was the mountain blocking our advance, with the fort making it impractical to ignore. The technological edge was no longer with America, which is commonly referred to as the end of the American Renaissance. But by being the first movers, they were able to catch the Kree fort to the east of Wahok by surprise, using it to withstand the superior infantry's attack. This pinning allowed the American artillery to set up and open fire at point-blank range. This fire control prevented reinforcements from reaching Yosemite Fort, which itself was put under constant barrage, until their inevitable surrender opened the floodgates. The generals took these lessons of war well, employing new army tactics, making up for inferior line infantry with superior strategy, holding the east while the artillery tears down Wahok's walls, securing the city and razing it to the ground, opting to replace it with an American settlement. But this wasn't the end. The Kree could easily regroup and take the city back. Meanwhile, Canada, despite losing Milwaukee, has been suspiciously quiet ever since, as at this very moment, their leader, who looked a lot like Jefferson Davis, was plotting something that threatened to tear America apart. Despite that, there was still the Kree Midwest to deal with to secure the God-given borders of America. The artillery was made to bomb the defensive encampments erected shortly before, while the infantry made to break through the north of the mountain pass. This military success was counteracted with diplomatic failures, as America was increasingly isolated on the world stage, with even their ally of Brazil refusing to send aid. But this did little to change the situation on the ground, as the fort eventually fell. Before the army used the defensive mountains meant to protect the city against it by putting it under siege. The problem is the artillery couldn't work when the infantry garrison was constantly harassing them. The solution isn't obvious, as the artillery needs to be on the front line in order to fire, as they can't aim over hills they can't see over. This issue is further exacerbated by Kree relief efforts that threatened to break the siege. However, quick thinking prevailed, as this relief force was swiftly outflanked and destroyed. After this long battle of attrition went on for more time, and heavy losses taken by the American army, the city was eventually taken, opening up an open route into the west of the Kree's empire. But they're not done yet, as our artillery was spent and couldn't withstand another onslaught that was sure to come on the next city's wide open plains. And so we had to improvise, buying an observation balloon to act as a spotter, allowing artillery crews to fire from a safe position. And with that, the Kree city stood no chance, as it was raised and replaced with a new line demarcating the border, with just Buffalo Point left to be taken. But while the city was put under siege, something peculiar happened. Canadian city rebelled, expecting to be let into our empire like Milwaukee. That doesn't look like American territory to me, as infantry began sieging down the now free city. They would soon meet the fate of Buffalo Point, that was itself razed to the ground to make room for our very important straight lines. But that line couldn't be extended when the rebel city fell due to the Great Lakes, instead using this free space to further enrich core American cities. Before advancing on the Western Front, we learned from the Kree's ancient tribal techniques of AK-47s and trench warfare to upgrade our infantry armies before pressing west. With our artillery, the city shouldn't have been a problem, but with the open terrain in their capital just north, they could easily send reinforcements directly towards my infantry, making the situation untenable. While the leaders were thinking of how to rectify that situation, an Eastern army was being mustered from the veterans of the Canadian Massacre, just in case Wilfred, who looks shockingly like Jefferson Davis, issues a protest against our straight lines. But the bulk of the focus was out west, as the enemy infantry did huge damage to our artillery. This required us to use our own infantry to defend our flanks, eliminating the threat posed to our siege units, who rained fire on the city of Kidyal, taking it soon after, leaving only one settlement left. But unlike the previous cities of Buffalo Point and Kidyal, this would be the toughest city America would ever have to face. With an impenetrable mountain wall, we had no hope of breaking its defenses without a secret weapon. But for now, the more pressing concern was Canada, and how one city, Pittsfield, would complete our American border restoration. And so, America showed them how to declare a formal war. Thanks for denouncing me, dumbass. And with their technological backwardness, we make mincemeat of their units and take the city. Now just one more city and we would have our Western plans, and thus American plans, all but complete. But the question remains, how do we deal with this conundrum? Ninja art. Napalm strike. With this new special move, the city of Vancouver was taken shortly afterwards, as our hopes and dreams were finally realized. The establishment of the entirety of America's border, I'm not doing Alaska or Hawaii, meant that for now America could demobilize, resting on their laurels as the masters of the Americas, ensuring peace for the next century. Maybe even wait, what's that noise? Jefferson Davis declared a slave revolt. Not leading the slaves, of course, just using their labor for a never-ending free trial. The South wasn't the only nation that rose, as the loyalty issues meant that the entire West Coast our brave troops had worked so hard to achieve might be lost to this illegitimate state. But the first move was ours, where air power was used to bombard critical fronts, making sure to avoid enemy anti-air. In the seas, the Union had the decisive advantage thanks to their massive industry, using it to siege down Orlando and begin an operation to blockade the South in an Anaconda plan. Meanwhile, the biggest threat to their cities, artillery, was swiftly neutralized by their tanks, serving to simultaneously destroy their anti-air, a strategy we employ further out west to remove their potential from killing our units from range. The rebels responded by making a play for the Midwest fort, but the Union had learned from the failures of the Aztec and Cree fortifications, as the defenses were further reinforced and the siege went nowhere. But the Union wasn't the only war participant that could learn, using the same flanking maneuver to even greater effect, destroying an artillery crew in one shot while their planes heavily bombarded our Western forces. The good news is that they are nowhere near as industrialized as the North, and so don't have the skills to extract the resources they possess, making their units less effective. While they enjoyed an advantage out west, the East was Union soil. The fall of Orlando proved that before moving to use the nut strategy on their concentration in the Midwest, heavily bombarding and flanking their units, surrounding them, and effectively destroying that army. With that, all that was left was the Western Front, but we didn't make as much progress there, despite the anti-air, as there were just too many troops eliminating our units and establishing local superiority, forcing our generals to make risky moves. But in the East, they were in a full retreat, and after mopping up, the Eastern Front was besieged, leading to the fall of Montgomery. Meanwhile, the Navy moved in on the treacherous French, and to encircle the entire American South from the Atlantic. This attack from all angles left the Southern generals stuck trying to plug holes in on the front, moving forces away from the West. An opportunity we used to take the city of St. George, and then Oklahoma, and soon after New Orleans was on the brink. This collapsing situation was made worse, not by some battlefield development, but by the emancipation that followed in our now federal democracy by the people, for the people. While their forces were smashed and Anaconda Plan had succeeded, it wasn't over yet, as they could still plead for aid from abroad, which wouldn't be able to withstand a full-strength USA that would inevitably come once they've secured things back home. But eventually, the last stronghold that could be held, the western city of Fresco, had fallen, and after defeating the Beverage Cult, Air Force, and their armor, the door to their capital was now wide open. The inevitable emergency came a little too late, as we finally secured the contiguous United States, setting us up for a future of peace, prosperity, but not hegemony, as that would require taking out all 62 other civs on this map, just like I did in this video right here.